Hello everyone. For this week's tutorial, I would like to discuss making transitions, aka seamless backgrounds, within your image using the clone and healing tools, and also bitmap images, also known as palette images, as well as adjustment layers. These are all useful concepts before you get to officially animating your image. We will first begin with adjustment layers, which is very similar to layer effects. You may notice how similar to the blending modes discussed in the 7th video, the adjustment layers are divided into different categories. In particular, the first group imposes a solid image on top of the layer you are choosing to adjust, with the options being solid color, gradient, and pattern. The solid color option does not allow you to customize it as you apply it, although it does allow you to customize it by selecting the foreground color. However, the gradient and pattern options do allow you to customize them and give you pop-up dialogues like so, with all the options for customization. Notice how all the effect options are linked to a grayscale layer mask. This layer mask works the same way as the other ones and allows you to adjust the opacity of the adjustment layer. The next group is based on lightness and darkness. The specific filters are brightness/contrast, which allows you to use sliders to change the brightness and contrast in the image, as suggested in the title. And there is also a legacy checkbox, which will apply the brightness and contrast at a different intensity than the other option. The next option is levels, which allows you to determine the concentration of shadows, midtones, and highlights in an image according to sliders. You can isolate red, green, and blue individually with the adjustment layer, or you can affect all red, green, and blue at once, like so. The next option, curves, can be best described as a more fiddly version of levels. The option gets its name because you determine the lighting based on a curve rather than by sliders, like so. The final lighting and darkening option is exposure. This option allows you to set a slider for exposure, which determines the increase in lighting throughout the image, and also an offset, which determines the overall lighting in the image, rather than simply the increases in difference. And finally, gamma correction, which sets the gamma in the image. Like so. The next group after lightness and darkness options is color-based options. The first option is vibrance, which allows you to use a slider to determine the saturation in the image. And the vibrance, which is similar to saturation, only not as intense. The next option is hue/saturation, which allows you to adjust the hue, saturation, and luminosity of the image. You can check whether these sliders apply to master, which is the entire image with all the colors, or to a specific color. You can also check mark whether to colorize it, which means to override all the colors in the image with one specific color that is determined by the hue slider. Like so. Changing hue, saturation, and luminosity with master. With a specific color. And with colorize. Notice that with colorize, you cannot affect a specific color. But this logically makes sense because colorize filter, by definition, makes it so that it's only one color. The next option, color balance, allows you to determine the red, green, and blue concentrations in either the shadows, midtones, or highlights. There is also a checkmark to preserve luminosity, which, as suggested in the title of the checkbox, preserves the luminosity of the original image. If you uncheck it, it will override it with the luminosity of the concentration you assign. Like so. Notice the very, very subtle difference when preserved luminosity is unchecked. The next option, black and white, gets rid of all colors and makes it only on a grayscale. It works in a slightly unusual way, with the 6 colors, red, green, blue, yellow, cyan, and magenta, being assigned a negative to positive scale each, with the negative end meaning the color becomes more black, and the positive end means the color becomes more white. There is also an option to colorize it, and there's a color picker next to the colorize check mark, which will determine the specific color you want to replace black. Like so. The next option, photo filter, applies a very subtle color on top of the adjustment layer. The one slider determines how strongly this color should be applied, and the color picker above determines the specific color that should be applied. Like so. There is also a check mark to preserve luminosity. The next filter, Channel Mixer, works in a very similar way to the black and white filter. In particular, you select the color you want to blend in, red, green, or blue, and the concentration this should be applied to on the red, green, and blue channels, or total for the entire image, like so. Notice that there is also a monochromatic checkbox, which works very similar to the original black and white filter. The next filter, Color Lookup, uses lookup tables, which we will not be using right now. The last group is Miscellaneous and combines lighting and colors. The first of these options is Invert, which inverts the lighting so that shadows become highlights and vice versa, and also inverts the hues so that it looks like it is reflected 180 degrees on the color wheel, like so. The next option, Posterize, reduces the number of colors in the image. This often makes the lighting look more dramatic because there is less transitions, like so. The levels determines the specific number of colors you want to keep. The next option, Threshold, makes your image entirely black and white. With the higher the threshold, the more black is emphasized, and the lower the threshold, the more white is emphasized, like so. The next option, Gradient Map, makes your image black and white as well, and this time uses a gradient to determine the lighting levels, like so. Notice that you can change the color of the gradient to colorize it. The next option, Selective Color, allows you to determine from one of the 6 major colors discussed earlier and determine the concentration of CMYK colors, aka cyan, magenta, yellow, and black, in it. In addition to the 6 major colors, you can also limit it to white, black, or neutral, which means all colors at once, like so. The last option, Replace Color, replaces a specific color, and you can also have a fuzziness threshold above it to determine the threshold of the colors nearby it that it should affect as well. The other sliders are hue, saturation, and luminosity, as usual, like so. As mentioned earlier, all adjustment layers come with a mask to determine how it blends with the layer beneath it. Now that we have discussed adjustment layers, we can discuss seamless blending. You may recall how I went over image filters in the 7th tutorial video in addition to masks and blending modes. This will come in handy because we will use the offset filter to make the edges more apparent. This filter has horizontal and vertical scrolling and will automatically wrap the image around if you move it off the screen. Like so. We have now clearly isolated the edges of the image. Notice the vertical edges are more pronounced than the horizontal ones, although they both are there. Once you are satisfied with having your edges clearly showing, you can fix them either using the healing tool or the clone tool. Like so, I will only be fixing the more subtle edge in this demonstration. The last thing I would like to discuss is palette images. Palette images work very similar to the posterize filter, in that instead of having red, green, and blue channels with 255 values in them, they only have 255 colors, period. So the number of colors is drastically reduced compared to non-bitmap images. In the current program I am working on, we do not have palettes, but in GIMP we do. I will therefore be switching over to GIMP for both color palettes and to demonstrate how adjustment layers and seamless textures work there. Strangely enough, in GIMP, all the adjustment layers are kept right beneath the Color tab. In particular, the first one is Color Balance, which works the same way as in Photoshop/Photopia. Color Temperature, which is very similar to saturation, like so. With original temperature being vibrance and intended temperature being saturation. Hue chroma, which is like hue, saturation, and value, except saturation is replaced with chroma, and you can only affect the entire image at once. You cannot isolate specific colors like you can with the hue saturation option, like so. hue saturation with a color wheel diagram, allowing you to isolate specific colors instead of a drop-down menu, like so. Saturation, which allows you to determine only the saturation of the entire image. There are no hue or lightness sliders, like so. Exposure, with offset being referred to as black level rather than its actual name, but exposure itself given the same name, and no gamma correction, like so. Shadows highlights, which allows you to control the percentage shadow increase or percentage highlight increase, but no midtones, like so. Notice that there is slight adjustments to the shadows and highlights, and there is also white point adjustment, radius, and compress features that allow you to fine-tune your lighting even more. Brightness contrast, with levels strangely being built in as a clickable pop-up window, even though it applies as a separate filter as well. Like so. Levels, curves, invert, linear invert, which makes the darkness and lightness change more drastically than regular invert, like so. Value invert, which only inverts the lighting but preserves the colors. Equalize, which attempts to equalize the contrast so that it is about the same throughout the image, like so. White balance, which increases the concentration of white. Stretch contrast, which increases the contrast only very slightly, like so. Stretch contrast HSV, which appears to do the same thing. Color enhance, which attempts to make bright colors even brighter, like so. Color enhance legacy, which is more subtle than the default color enhance. Channel mixer, which instead of having red, green, and blue as drop-down options, now has them all displayed at once. In separate tabs, like so. Extract component, which allows you to extract a specific component. And you can also invert the component which will invert the output and make the output linear. Mono mixer, which works the same way as monochrome on channel mixer, like so. Decompose, which will have all the channels broken down into a separate image based on your selection, like so. Color to gray, which has a radius option, an iterations option, and a samples option. It also has a check mark to enhance shadows, like so. Desaturate, which allows you to determine whether to desaturate it based off of lightness, luminance, or HSV value, like so. There is also an option for the averaging of saturation values to desaturate. Strangely, the mono mixer comes up again next, but works the same exact way as the first time. Sepia, which reduces your colors to tones of brown. And you can determine how pronounced these tones of brown are with the slider. We will skip mapping for now because we'll discuss that with palette images. And we will skip tone mapping for the same reason we skipped it in Photoshop/Photopea. And we will also skip info because it does not change the colors, it only gives us information about them. This leads us to threshold, which works the same way as in Photoshop/Photopea. Colorize, which works the same way as in Photoshop/Photopea. Posterize, which works the same way as in Photoshop/Photopea, like so. Color to alpha, which converts a specific color to alpha. And you can pick the specific color, as well as thresholds for transparency and opacity, like so. Dither, which applies noise. But RGB clip, which limits red, green, and blue values to a specific range, with you determining the lower threshold and upper threshold, like so. Now that we have gone over how adjustment layers work in GIMP, we can discuss color palettes. A color palette uses entries specifically known as indexes, which are little boxes on a map that you can fill in with whatever color you want. You can change the number of columns overall throughout the palette, although you cannot change the rows specifically, so you'll have to get used to them depending on the number of columns and seeing how the rows change with them. You can also edit individual entries, add new entries from the foreground color, delete entries, and zoom out and in of the entire color map. You can access custom color maps through the Palette Editor tab, which you can bring up if you do not see it by default. The other palette-related tab is a list of pre-made palettes, like so. You will see in parentheses next to the name is the number of colors within the palette. Once you have determined which palette you like, we can move over to the map adjustment layers. The first one is Alien Map, which uses trig functions like sine waves to alter the colors of the image, like so. The next option is Color Exchange, which exchanges one particular color with another. And you can also determine thresholds for shades of red, green, and blue to detect in the two colors, like so. Rotate Colors is the next filter and allows you to spin the color wheel for source, destination, and even gray handles. Gray handling refers to how it deals with gray areas or tones within the colors. The next option is Gradient Map, which works the same way as in Photoshop, except this time the gradient is customized with a gradient editor shown earlier in the third video, rather than with a pop-up window. The next option is Palette Map, which applies the palette you have chosen onto the image, like so. The last option is Sample Colorize, which allows you to sample either an image or a gradient pattern to colorize the image. Sadly, there is no offset filter in GIMP, and so we cannot do seamless images as we could in Photoshop/Photopea. Although it may seem strange that I introduced adjustment layers and color palettes so late, it is because they are often used in GIF animation, which will be the topic of the next video. This is because GIFs are built on color palettes, specifically 256 color palettes. In the same way that JPEG and PNG images are based off of channels with 255 6 colors each. This means that a single image GIF will be much lesser in file size because it will have much less colors to keep track of than JPEG or PNG. The other part of the equation, adjustment layers, are often used in the frames of animated GIFs to make them different from one another. Finally, I introduced seamless backgrounds this way because they are often used in backgrounds in animated GIFs or videos like cartoons in order to make the background warp around smoothly as the characters run. With all of the basic concepts out of the way, we are now able to move on to animating GIFs. Join me in next week's tutorial where we will do just that. Don't forget to subscribe if you found this video informative, and make sure to visit the other tutorial videos and follow me on either Facebook or Twitter for more content.